أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Well, welcome back everybody to our third session of Holding Fast, understanding principles for understanding prophetic guidance on fasting. Welcome back to those of you who are joining again for the third week. We're halfway through our content, and inshallah today and next week we'll be finishing off the course. So let's begin as we normally do with a quick recap on what we covered the past week, the past 2 weeks, inshallah. So the title for today's session and the content we'll be covering is a continuation of our discussion of weak ahadith. And then we'll get into the work of the jurist in terms of legal application of hadith, inshallah. So a quick recap from our first 2 sessions. These are the questions that we've already discussed, explored together. First of all, how does the hadith relate to the sunnah? And that's the main takeaway from the course, which we unpacked further by looking at what are the grades of a hadith authenticity. And then we talked about last week how a hadith is authenticated or evaluated. And then we started into the discussion of what we do with weak ahadith. Are they always discarded? Which weak ahadith are applied? And why would they be strengthened or considered or applied? So this is, again, the main kind of visual summary of the course that I want us to always have in mind, that a hadith is a single anecdote, a single data point, and that the specialists of hadith, they're interested simply in the question of attribution or of ascription to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the main question that they explore is, did the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam say a particular thing or do a particular thing? So that's done piecemeal, hadith by hadith. Whereas the jurists, represented on the right here, they're interested in uncovering the sunnah. And that requires that they consider all of the relevant data points and analyze and synthesize collectively all of the relevant evidence and statements and actions of the Prophet, as well as other types of evidence, which we'll look at a little bit more today. And they're looking for the sunnah, what is representative, what is normative from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We talked about this division of labor between the hadith scholars and the jurists. And then we focused primarily in the first 2 sessions on the work of the muhaddithin, of the hadith specialists. We talked about the grades of authenticity, what are the possible answers to the question of, did the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam say something? And here are the answers that we provided. And then we focused primarily on the sahih, da'if, and hasan. And last week we spoke about the 5 conditions for a hadith to be considered sahih: that it has a connected chain, that all of its narrators or transmitters are both trustworthy, meaning they're morally upright, as well as accurate, meaning that they properly and accurately transmit that which they heard. And then, in addition to looking at the individual transmitters in the chain, we also talked about how hadith specialists will compare hadith reports against other reports to discover any anomalies, any mistakes that accrued in the process of transmission. And then they'll also look for hidden defects of, again, these subtle errors that would occur in the transmission, whether it's in the isnad, the chain of transmitters, or in the matan, in the report. So for a hadith to be considered sahih, it has to meet these 5 conditions. And if any one condition is not met, then the entire hadith is considered da'if. And then the hasan, as we've mentioned several times now, is an extension of the sahih in that it meets almost all of the conditions, except for the third, the condition of accuracy, in which there is a little bit of lightness or weakness. Now, I just want to mention a few additional notes to what we've said. And I think they might also answer some of the questions that I didn't have a chance to touch on last week. So first of all, that the focus of authentication, of this entire endeavor of authenticating reports ascribed to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, the focus is primarily, almost entirely on the isnad, on the chain of transmitters. As we just saw a second ago, we're interested in if the chain of transmitters is connected, if everybody's transmitting directly from the person that they heard it from, right? Not through a third party, right? Or not having skipped a generation. And we're interested in the isnad, the men and the women that are in the isnad, in their trustworthiness and in their reliability and their accuracy. So to focus on the isnad, we're not really talking about the actual content of the report of the matan, right? In some of the analyses of the hadith scholars in determining anomalies and in determining hidden defects, they do look at the matan to some extent, but not insofar as they're interested primarily. Almost, it's very rare that they're actually interested in the content of the report, right? And there's some exceptions and details and nuances there, but generally speaking, as hadith scholars, they're just interested in, did the Prophet say it or not what the hadith actually says, okay? Secondly, the hadith, the grading or the evaluation of a hadith, meaning if it's considered sahih or da'if, is often subject to disagreement, okay? And this is something I think that's important to keep in mind, right? So any hadith that, for example, Bukhari didn't include in his collection, right? By not including it, there's an assumption that he didn't consider it sahih by his conditions, right? Whereas others, like Tirmidhi, for example, or Muslim, they might include a hadith in their collection that they consider sahih, which Bukhari didn't consider sahih, right? And this is in the generation of contemporaries or near contemporaries, Muslim, Bukhari, and Tirmidhi. And after that as well, there's disagreement and debate. It's an ijtihadi matter, right? So they'll disagree on individual transmitters. Is this transmitter sufficiently accurate to be considered, for his transmission to be considered sahih? Many people will say yes, some people will say, actually, no, we don't think so, right? So therefore that hadith would be hasan for some and sahih for others. But it's a rarely significant disagreement. So it's extremely rare that some scholars and some, especially the top echelon of hadith experts, it's very rare that they would consider something sahih and others would consider it da'if, okay? In contrast, those who have very exacting conditions like Bukhari and Muslim, they might consider some hadith not sahih, but others who have less exacting conditions like Al-Hakim and others would consider it sahih, right? So it's an ongoing, it's not one person or just 5 or 6 people, it's hundreds and thousands of specialists that are debating, that there's different conditions, different criteria, different observations, different understandings. So it's a scholarly enterprise. It's not an exact science, which means you're not going to have exact conclusions. But generally speaking, it's rare that you'd have a very significant disagreement. So what I mean is generally, if a hadith is considered very da'if, some might consider it mawdu', right? Or if a hadith is considered, if a hadith is considered, only lightly da'if, others might consider it hasan. So some might consider, it's weak. Others may say, actually, no, it's actually hasan or sahih, right? So generally speaking, a hadith will have several different evaluations depending on which specialist you're speaking to. And then, later scholars like Ibn Hajar and others that come later, and Imam Nawawi, they'll try to settle these debates and to explain why there's divergences and to kind of bring together all of the different opinions and themselves to come up with a conclusion, right? So this is important to keep in mind, especially when we think about the contemporary movement of kind of reevaluating some hadith, which I spoke about briefly at the end of the last session. Because, in as much as there's already been, 1,000+ years of debate concerning these ahadith, and there's been, a range of opinions about certain ahadith, it's very difficult to come up with something new that hasn't already been considered, and to have that, be more probative or more likely than that which the experts have already concluded, right? So that's just something to keep in mind, that it's not new to reassess a hadith, but that's already been done multiple times by multiple generations. And then finally, what is the hadith, quote unquote, that's being graded? So this is something that came up several times last week, where we saw a hadith that the first part of it was sahih, and then the additional the additional part at the end, or the addition, is not sahih. It's been added by one of the transmitters, or that part is not sahih because it's not supported by other chains of transmission, for example. So what is the hadith being graded, right? So we need to be very exacting when we say the hadith is da'if. Well, what do you mean exactly? First of all, which part of the hadith? That's number one. And number two, is the hadith corroborated by other ahadith that would then raise the status of that hadith? So we saw examples of corroboration where something was da'if, but it had other corroborating texts that supported the meaning, and therefore that hadith was raised from da'if to potentially hasan li ghayrihi, or extrinsically hasan because of corroboration, right? So, and I'm saying this, and again, we're literally scratching the very surface of the iceberg, just the tiny little tip at the top, right? So there's a lot more detail that goes into this. There's a lot more nuance. There's a lot, just a lot more. So the reason I'm emphasizing these points is because they're practical, right? So when someone tells you that the hadith is da'if, okay, what does that actually mean, right? So is it da'if in all of its transmissions, in all of its narrations, right? Is it corroborated? Is its meaning correct, even if it's formally weak? There's a lot that needs to go into that. And that's the importance of specialization and of scholarship, because just picking up a book and opening it and reading it is really not sufficient. Okay, so with those additional notes now, let's turn back to continuing what we started, which is the question of why are weak ahadiths applied, or how are they applied, or when are they applied, right? So we talked about, first of all, corroboration, right? So that a weak report could be corroborated by other transmissions, direct and indirect, that would raise its authenticity from weak to potentially hasan, to sound, right? So we talked about a full corroborator, which is someone who is transmitting the same hadith from the same sahabi, here Abu Hurairah, right? So essentially identical wording, or identical or near identical meaning, right? So it's not a different hadith. And then we can have a partial corroborator, or a shahid, that would be a hadith from another companion. So it's a different hadith altogether, which could either be identical in wording or in meaning, or just close enough that it's corroborating some of that other hadith, right? And we saw an example of that with the dua of breaking the fast. And we'll look at that again in a second, but that it can be raised, its level can be raised from weak because of this corroboration, right? So this was the example we looked at, the hadith by Mu'adh ibn Zuhra, that he reported that it reached him that when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ would break his fast, he would say, "Oh Allah, for your sake have I fasted, and upon your sustenance I break my fast." And then we looked at the report and we said that Mu'adh ibn Zuhra is not a companion, and therefore there's a disconnect in the chain, because he would be narrating from another tabi'i, or from a sahabi who we have not identified. So it's weak because of the disconnect, right? But then we looked at other corroborations, one by Anas, one by Ibn Abbas, that were also considered weak for other reasons, right? And then we also saw a hadith of Ibn Umar and Ibn Abbas that were Hasan, and they were partial corroborators in that they weren't the exact same method, not the same report, but they emphasize the same principle, the idea of breaking the fast with a supplication, and echoed some of the meanings of that supplication, right? So we could then, some scholars would then conclude that although the hadith of Mu'adh ibn Zuhra itself is weak due to a disconnect, its meaning, its report, its matan, could be raised to extrinsically hasan, potentially because of that corroboration, okay? So now let's go back, let's continue now looking at other reasons why weak ahadith would be applied, okay? The second reason is this concept of attestation, okay? And the third is the encouragement of good deeds, which we will look at subsequently. So attestation, to its meaning, essentially means that a hadith, the report itself, when we look at the chain of transmitters, okay, formally it does not meet the conditions to be considered authentic or sahih, okay? So formally it doesn't meet those conditions. However, the meaning of the hadith itself echoes the meaning of the Qur'an. It echoes the meaning of many other ahadith that are sahih. And it's possibly supported by a consensus, the meaning of the hadith. Okay, not the transmission, but the meaning. Okay. And it's widely applied by jurists. So to give you two examples of this, there's a hadith that says la wasiyata li warith, that the inheritor does not receive a wasiyah, a bequest. So a bequest is basically a portion of property that the person puts into their will that would go to someone who is not receiving inheritance, right? So if you're receiving inheritance, as this weak hadith indicates, you cannot also receive this portion, which can be up to 1/3. You can't also be receiving a bequest. That would have to go to someone who's not inheriting from the deceased, right? So the hadith itself is weak. It doesn't meet the conditions. However, the meaning is attested to by so many other, understandings from the Quran, from the hadith, and it's widely applied. This is applied by all jurists, that the person who inherits does not receive a bequest, right? Another hadith with the same sort of attestation and broad support is this hadith in which the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, speaking about seawater, one of the companions asked him, is it permissible to make wudu with water from the sea? And he responded, هو الطهور ماؤه الحل ميتته, that seawater, is purifying, and ميتته, its non-ritually slaughtered food, is permissible to consume. This is a really beautiful hadith because although it's formally weak, right, it shows us the way in which the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, his kind of pedagogical method, right? So the companion just asked him, is wudu with seawater permissible? The answer is yes or no. But instead, he gives him a broader principle. He gives him two broad principles, that it's purifying, right? Not just for wudu, but also to purify, for example, najasa, because it's tahur. So therefore, you can use it for any type of purification, not only wudu and ghusl and other things, right? And al-hillu maytatuhu, that anything that is fished from it is and doesn't have to be ritually slaughtered. So if you fish something that's already dead, for example, it's permissible to consume it, right? So he gives him an answer that is, broader, and gives him principles and not just the answer for that particular circumstance he was asking about. So this hadith as well, formally it's weak, but it's in the books of fiqh, you'll see this hadith quoted time and time again as a principle, right? That the seawater is tahur, pure and purifying, and that its food is permissible even if it's not ritually slaughtered, right? So this is the idea of attestation. So some weak ahadith, right, formally weak, will be attested to through other sources, other principles, other verses, other ahadith, and therefore you'll find that they're often quoted in fiqh or even to a broad audience, right? So possibly another example of this is the hadith concerning the month of Ramadan, right? That it's divided into three parts, right? Of forgiveness, of rahmah, of forgiveness, and of freedom from the hellfire. So that hadith formally, some consider it weak, right? But it's not something it's something that we use in an exhortative capacity because it's attested to by other ahadith and broadly understood and applied by the ummah, that this is the way in which we welcome the month, that it's divided into these three parts, right? But then some people, they are not comfortable with using any weak ahadith at all, and they will, if you quote a hadith like that, they will make sure that it's weak, but that's really not the point, right? So this is a second reason or second way in which we would apply weak ahadith, and the second reason for which jurists would be quoting and using and applying weak ahadith. Now the third reason is actually the primary reason and way in which most ahadith that we're familiar with outside of kind of a detailed fiqhi legal context, this is generally the reason, this is an explanatory framework for the use of weak ahadith in most cases. So I really want you to pay attention to this. So in the encouragement of good deeds, of fada'il al-amal, okay, weak reports can be used to encourage good deeds and virtues or to discourage sins and vices with the following conditions. And the conditions are very important, okay? So the first condition is that the weakness is light. Okay, It's not extremely weak. It's a little bit weak. And I'll talk about that in detail in a minute. The second condition is that it falls under a general basis, okay? Which means that there's some foundation for it in the Quran or in the authentic hadith, right? It's not an anomalous report that is completely counter to everything that we already understand about the religion. And third, that the one who's teaching it, quoting it, and also the one applying it should not believe it to be attributed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, so while he's applying it, that he doesn't have this belief that this is something the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam definitively did. Okay, so these conditions and this discussion, this is, I would say, the kind of majority opinion of most of the jurists in our history. There is another opinion where weak hadith in general should not be relied upon, but this, I would say, is the amal of the ummah, the practice of the ummah has generally been using this framework. And these conditions are mentioned by people like Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani and Nawawi, Ibn Abd salam and Izzuddin ibn Abd salam and others, right? So let's talk about these three conditions in a little bit more detail. And this is the nuance of the fact that weak ahadith are quite a big spectrum of possibilities, right? So the question is, how weak is weak, right? How weak is weak? So as I mentioned from the first class, a hadith would be classed as weak, and yet it could be from a 1% probability that Prophet Muhammad said something, meaning it's extremely unlikely, it's almost fabricated, and some might even consider it fabricated, or it's 80%, okay, upwards to 80%, that the weakness is very light, right? It's not significant. And the distinctions here would be, again, for example, intense weakness would be a transmitter who's very unreliable, right? Someone who is very inaccurate all the time, and there's a big X on them, or someone who's known to fabricate a hadith, or sometimes, fabricate a hadith, or who's not trustworthy, or, several disconnections in the chain. Someone just says the Prophet Muhammad said something with no chain of transmission at all, something like that, that would be extremely weak, right? Whereas light weakness could be that one of these conditions is not met, right? Formally, okay? It's disconnected, for example, but the type of disconnect is not the same as, multiple disconnects and multiple weak transmitters. All of the transmitters, let's say, are reliable, and yet they didn't name one of their sources, right? But we know who they normally narrate from, for example. So let me give you an example of something that's very light. The weakness of it is very light, and therefore it's broadly applied in fiqh. So when a tabi'i, so as you know, the tabi'in are the generation following the Prophet's companions, right? So they are the following generation. These are people who didn't meet the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, but they met the companions. Now the tabi'in as a class are divided into senior tabi'in and junior tabi'in, and sometimes also kind of in between tabi'in, okay? So the senior tabi'in are people who were possibly alive at the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, or, children, but never met him, never narrated from him, or were born soon thereafter. So they basically grew up around the companions of the Prophet, right? And many of them, were also scholars, they were known to be trustworthy. They kind of grew up with the companions. Some of them were raised by the companions, like Hassan al-Basri, Sa'id ibn Musayyib, some of these names you might recognize. So if a senior successor, a senior tabi'i, transmits directly from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Okay, so for example, if Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, who was born in the 14th year of Hijrah, and he died in the 94th year of Hijrah, okay? So if Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib says, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said something, okay? And he doesn't name the companion that he is transmitting from. He just says, Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib said the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said something, okay? Now, what are the possibilities for Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib? Okay, there's two possibilities. He could either be narrating from a companion, okay, and as we mentioned, the companions are all upright, trustworthy transmitters, or he could be transmitting from another senior tabi'i like himself, someone else who's not a companion, who then narrates through the companion. So it's possible that there's two links. So either he's narrating directly through a companion, like Anas, for example, Or let's say he's transmitting through Hassan al-Basri through Anas. Okay? So there could be one link or two. So let's say there's a 50-50 chance of each of these possibilities, just for the sake of kind of a rational, two rational possibilities, let's say 50-50, right? Now, the senior tabi'in, there's maybe around 200 of them, and all of like 190 some, 195 or something like that were considered thiqat, reliable and accurate, right? So if he's transmitting through a senior senior tabi'i through a companion, right? Then the likelihood is both of the transmitters in that chain are both reliable and accurate, right? So we would say then that the likelihood that his transmission is through a trustworthy chain of transmissions, right, is upwards of 75%. Okay, because we're saying 50%, 50%, and no matter which case it is, it's almost certain that his sources are reliable, right? So when Sa'id ibn Musayyib narrates directly from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, although formally, right, in the parlance and in the criteria of the hadith scholars, it's weak because there's a disconnect. We don't know who he's narrating from. The jurists, right, will say that the transmission of Sa'id ibn Musayyib, the marasil, his hadith mursal, this is what the category it falls into, that they are extremely valuable, in fact. And Imam Shafi'i, for example, makes an exception for Sa'id ibn Musayyib's transmissions from the Prophet directly, because he considers him not just a senior tabi'i, but he is himself also a reliable transmitter, and he's also a scholar. He's a jurist in and of himself, right? So he knows what he's transmitting, and he's careful in what he's transmitting, right? So this is an example of a hadith that formally is weak, but it's a very light weakness, and therefore it would be considered very weighty in the process of derivation, right? So going back now to this question of encouragement of good deeds, right? So if a hadith is weak, okay, but its weakness is light, so something like what I just described, but that's kind of, the highest level of the lowest level of weakness, let's say. It's a very considerable a daif hadith, right? So the weakness is light, it's غير شديد, it's not an intense weakness. And then it falls under a general basis, okay? So for example, and let me just give some examples of what are some of these acts that some would argue fall under these categories, right? The fasting of the 15th day of Sheibani, right? So the hadith about this practice are considered weak, right? However, there's a general basis for fasting in general, right? It's always a sunnah, it's always recommended to fast. And there's also a general basis of fasting in the month of Sha'ban, that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam fasted the most in Rajab and in Sha'ban, right? And then we also have a kind of broad practice of the Ummah, and many of the scholars encourage the fasting of the 15th of Sha'ban, right? So there's a general basis for that practice. Many other, prayers as well that people, often will argue about. The Salah also the 15th of Sha'ban, Salatul Raghaib, Salatul Tasbih, which some of them consider the hadith to be Hasan, in fact, as well. So many of these practices that people would consider a bid'ah if they don't agree with either this framework, or that they disagree that the weakness is light, or that it does in fact fall under a general basis, right? And then finally, this condition of not believing it to be definitively attributed to the Prophet, and that's important, right? So in as much as we say it's possible that he said this, and the weakness is light, therefore there's that possibility that it is something from the Prophet, plus it falls under a general basis, right? But when we do it and when we encourage people to do it, we're also honest about the fact that it's based on weak hadith. It's something that we encourage, but it's not necessarily a deliberatively or definitively a sunnah, right? So that's important. And just to go back to this example that we've already used of the supplication upon breaking the fast, right? From Mu'adh ibn Zuhra, we said that the hadith is weak because of the disconnect in the chain, that Mu'adh ibn Zuhra is a tabi'i, he narrates from the Prophet, and he doesn't have the same standing as someone like Sa'id ibn Musayyib, for example, right? So it's considered weak due to that disconnect. However, we also mentioned a partial corroborator, right? This hadith from Abdullah ibn Amr, that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, for the fasting person at the time of fasting, for the fasting person at the time of breaking his or her fast, there is a supplication that will not be turned away. And we said this hadith is hasan. So it's not just a partial corroborator, it's also a general basis for the practice that when you break the fast, the Prophet is telling us, you have a supplication that will be answered, right? So it's a general basis for the previous hadith where we say, Allahumma laka sumtu wa ala rizqika aftart, right? So it serves that dual purpose of both corroborating as well as a general basis. Okay, so that brings an end to our discussion of applying weak ahadith. Okay, so we talked about corroboration, wide attestation, and then the encouragement of good deeds with those conditions, right? So as far as we're concerned as non-specialist lay people, right? The takeaway here, again, just to emphasize this again, is not to go for ourselves and search for corroborations and see if something's attested to, or see how light is the weakness. That's a specialist craft, right? But it's for us to understand that when there's these weak ahadith that are applied, or acts that are encouraged on the basis of weak ahadith, right? That we understand that there is a basis for this and there is a methodology for this, right? So I mentioned some of these practices, some of these acts of worship, these fada'il, right? But also, there's oftentimes people will say in so-and-so's, book, Imam Ghazali's Ihya, he mentions weak ahadith. Again, with this framework, this is not a problem, right? The ahadith that he mentions are used to encourage good deeds, they're corroborated, and or they fall under a general basis. And most of the time, they're not very weak. Sometimes they are very weak. And again, the scholars after him, Imam al-Iraqi and others, and Subki, they all go into the details of nitpicking on the ahadith that maybe it would have been better not to mention because they are in fact fabricated or they are in fact very weak, right? But it's a specialist science. So the idea, for example, of let's throw the ihya away because it has weak ahadith in it is preposterous, to say the least, right? So that brings an end to our first half of our discussion, wrapping up this discussion about weak hadith, and I'll hopefully take any questions you have at the end. But I wanted to now shift to the second half of the course and the second half of this presentation on the craft of the jurist, which is the application of hadith, right? And we'll look at broadly these two questions of are authentic ahadith always applied? And why do Muslim jurists disagree in determining the sunnah? Okay, so we'll introduce this today and we'll finish it off, inshallah, next week. So the distinction again, and I know I'm sounding like a broken record here, but the distinction between the craft and the work of the muhaddith is authentication. In Arabic, we say tasheeh al-hadith, right? Authenticating the attribution or the ascription of the hadith to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, as for al-amal bil-hadith, the application of the hadith, this is where the jurists come in. And this is the work of the physicians in the statement of Imam Shafi'i, that they take now these these medications that have been prepared by the muhaddith and authenticated or weakened, and then they do their work of applying them al-amal bil hadith. How do we then apply it? What do we then do? What do we practice? What do we not practice? Okay. Now, to give a bit more nuance now, this picture that I've been showing on the left of one circle that describes what the sunnah represents, right? That is perfect. That is a representative illustration for when there's consensus on a matter. Okay, that all of the jurists would agree that this is in fact the sunnah, right? This is what we act. This is what we apply, right? However, most of the time, there's disagreement among the four schools of thought. And even within the four schools of thought. So we would have a diagram that looks more like what I have on the right, where people are drawing, the jurists are drawing the circle of what represents the sunnah in slightly, different places, locations, and directions. Okay. Now, the question I'm interested in exploring with you now is, why are these circles drawn in slightly different places? Okay. This is a whole other science. We've been looking at the science of hadith authentication. We scratched the surface of that. And now we're going to dip a toe into the ocean of usul al-fiqh, okay, or legal methodology. And if you've studied usul al-fiqh, you'll be very aware that what I'm presenting is a caricature, a dip in the ocean, just a little hole in a huge, wall. We're just going to poke a hole and try to see what's on the other side. It's by no means exhaustive. It's by no means detailed. It's by no means nuanced. There's a lot. This is First of all, each of the schools has its own set of usul al-fiqh. Okay, it's not one thing. They have different principles for deriving legal conclusions. And even within the school, there's some nuances and there's development and evolution over time and so on. So I'm just giving you a taste of some of the principles and how they do some of their work. Okay, so just be really aware that this is just a caricature and or just a very taste. It's just a little tiny taste of it. And hopefully it'll interest you in studying more and in uncovering more, and also realizing that this is, it really is a specialization, and it's very, sophisticated. It's very, rationally compelling. And when done well, the conclusions are as good as they can be, essentially, right? That it is, there's many things we can't know definitively, and probabilistically that the conclusions are very compelling, and they have a very strong basis for them. So what are some of the reasons that the schools differ? Okay, why do they draw these circles in slightly different places? Okay, so let me give you a few of these reasons. So one thing, first of all, is the authentication of hadith itself. So the conditions that I've mentioned to you are very general, but there's a lot of details that go into the theoretical conditions on the one hand of, like I mentioned, for example, that the transmissions of Sa'id ibn Musayyib, okay, their hadith considered marasil or hadith mursal, that technically speaking that they're weak because of that disconnect. But Imam Shafi'i, for example, considers his marasil to be, that his transmissions directly from the Prophet, he considers them to be probative, that they are something that are considered and that are applied and that are weighty in this process of weighing legal evidence, right? So there's different theoretical conditions. The Hanafi, so I've really presented kind of broadly what would be more or less a Shafi'i division of a hadith. The Hanafis agree with most of it, but they also have their own categories and considerations. So each of the schools, they also have their own usul al-hadith. Okay, they have different theoretical conditions for some of the categories of hadith. Okay, as well as the authentication of individual hadiths, right? So as I mentioned, the authentication in the grading itself, there's going to be disagreement about it. So sometimes one school will say, well, this hadith is sahih, and therefore it should take precedence over other evidence, whereas the other school will respond, actually, we don't consider that hadith sahih because of X, Y, and Z, right? So the authentication of hadith is, one thing, both theoretically and in terms of application, that accounts for one of the reasons that accounts for disagreement among the schools. Another reason is the very sources of fiqh. What are the usul that the schools consider, right? The sources for determining divine intent. We talked about in the first week the concept, for example, of amal ahl al-Madinah. So the Malikis have this distinctive doctrine of the amal, the practice of the people of Medina, right? Because they are only 2 or 3 generations removed from the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, that what they practice and what they apply for Imam Malik was considered to be a strong source of law, of proof, whereas Imam Shafi'i, who was previously a student of his, he in fact contradicts his teacher, disagrees with him, and critiques that very concept and that very theory of applying and giving weight to the practice of the people of Medina. So Imam Shafi'i says, they themselves, the Malikis themselves, the people of Medina themselves disagree, right? So what is this idea of amal ahl al-Madinah? The hadith itself should be given more weight, right? And the Hanafis and the Hanbalis as well, they have different sources. And so there's some sources that some schools only use. And then there's disagreement about the relative weight to give to different sources when they come into conflict, or when you have to look at this aggregate picture of all of the different proofs for a particular question, right? So we talked about the authentication of hadith, the sources that are considered, and then weighing between seemingly contradictory proofs. And we'll look at a case study of that in a second. So sometimes the hadith, quote unquote, seem to contradict, right? Or the hadith and the verses and the consensus and the reports from the companions, they're pointing in different directions. So how do we weigh between these different proofs? The schools will differ on that regard as well. And then finally, and kind of a first level, the very meaning and interpretation of each individual hadith or verse of the Qur'an, right? So there's different linguistic principles for interpreting verses and a hadith that will account for differences. So for example, in the ayah of wudu, right, that God says, وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ, right, that God's, he mentions the various steps of the wudu. And then he says, and wipe biru'usikum, right? Wipe your heads, right? Now the biru'usikum, wipe your heads, that ba, right, is subject to a lot of disagreement. So how much of the head needs to be wiped? So the Hanafis will have an opinion that you have to wipe at least, I think it's a quarter of the head. The Malikis consider, I think, the whole head. And the Shafi'is say, no, B just means a part of the head. So if you just touch at least, 2 or 3 hairs, that's enough, right? So it's the very, language itself lends itself to these ambiguities and these differences of opinion, right? So now, again, a caricature of the relative emphasis in the process of legal reasoning between the schools, okay? So there's one side that is more literalist, more textualist, meaning that they're more concerned with the literal wording of a text, and that they give texts, meaning I'm talking primarily about a hadith here, that they'll give the texts themselves, the hadith, more weight in the process of legal reasoning, okay? And then the other side of the spectrum gives more weight to rational proofs and rational principles and ways of reasoning. When you look at all of the different data, they're going to give a little bit more weight to some of these rational principles, as well as to communal practice, right? So if you wanted to put the schools on this spectrum, okay, it would look something like this, okay, that you would have the literalist school is the Zahiri school, which was an early school that essentially dissipated because, they expected that everything would be applied literally, and they didn't really have a lot of room for analogy or for figurative interpretation, and it was very difficult to sustain as a legal methodology, okay? And then the Hanbalis generally are also Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal's school. He was both a muhaddith and a jurist, and he gives more emphasis to a hadith than to rational principles like analogy or other rational principles that the other schools give more emphasis to. The Shafi'is on the spectrum would fall somewhere in the middle, right? If we take the Zahiris out, they would be further to the right, right? And then the Malikis and the Hanafis, generally speaking, would be more rational or more interested in conforming to the practice of the companions, and especially particular companions that were kind of the founding fathers of the Maliki school, and the Hanafis in Kufa, a different set of companions, right? So to the companion practice, to the communal practice that built up around those companions and in Medina for the Malikis, as well as more kind of rational principles for how you deal with these individual particular proofs, okay? We're gonna see more examples of how this works a little bit today, but more so next week as well. So I'm just giving you a spectrum. Again, this is a caricature. There's a lot of nuance, generally speaking, there's evolution from the early kind of founding school, the founders of the schools and their ways of reasoning, to later schools, especially in, this process of consolidation of legal doctrine and of scholars from different schools debating and discussing their doctrines, right? So the Shafi'is really emphasized this hadith paradigm that I've introduced in the first half of the course, and some of the other schools, although they didn't think about hadith in the same way, or they didn't reason in the same way, they ended up having to explain their conclusions in the language of hadith because they're in contact and in debate with these Shafi'is, right? So things change and they evolve, but generally speaking, this is the relative emphasis in the reasoning of the schools, right? Now, the last kind of theoretical discussion I'll introduce, and then we'll look at some examples that will hopefully help you to understand some of this, right, is how do we harmonize seemingly contradictory evidence? So at some point, all of the school, on any particular question or issue, right? So for example, if a person is fasting and they break their fast either by accident or on purpose, okay? The 2 legal questions. You break your fast by accident, you drink water, you forgot you were fasting, or on purpose, you break the fast because you're lazy and you don't have an excuse. Okay, so we have two different scenarios, right? So on both of these questions, okay, or on one of them or the other, right, you're going to have a number of different hadith that are considered because they are relevant to the question. You're going to have verses from the Qur'an, possibly. You're going to have reports from the companions. You're going to have analogy to other cases, right? And you need to now harmonize all of this evidence. And there's various ways of doing that, okay? So I want to talk about 3 ways of doing that, and we'll see how this works in a second. So one possibility is that there's a change in the ruling, okay? That at one point, for example, the Qibla, right? The companions used to pray towards Bayt al-Maqdis in Jerusalem. And then later on, there was a change in the ruling and they started facing Mecca, right? So there's a change in the ruling. So some verses or some hadith will speak about facing Bayt al-Maqdis. And then you'll read that and then you'll see the verses about Mecca and you'll be like, well, what happened? Well, those verses apply to before the change and the other verses or the other hadith apply to after the change. So there's a change in ruling and that's why it seems to contradict. The other possibility, okay, is to harmonize the evidence, okay? And you would do this in a number of ways. You would read, data point A in light of data point B, or you would say data point A applies to some people and data point B applies to other people or to some situations and then to other situations. You would basically keep all of the evidence, but apply it in different ways or join between them in different ways, okay? And the third possibility is you can't actually apply all of them, okay? You can't keep both things. So you have to weigh them out. You have to say which one is more preponderant, which one is stronger evidence, okay? And then you would give priority to the stronger evidence, but you wouldn't forget about the weaker evidence. You would then explain the weaker evidence in light of the stronger evidence, okay? So you would reinterpret, you would interpret the weak evidence in light of the stronger evidence, okay, in some form or the other, but you're giving priority really to the stronger evidence, okay? So let's look at a quick example of how this works. So here is a great example because it shows us all of these principles in action. So the question is, does cupping break the fast? Hijama. So I think most people know what hijama is. It's an ancient practice. It's a sunnah as well, where you have these cups that you place on the skin, and then you create a kind of suction, and it removes like toxins and some of the blood that's unhealthy from the body. Okay. So does cupping while you're fasting, okay, does it break the fast? So we have a number of ahadith, okay? And the interesting thing about these ahadith is that they're all authentic. So this doubles now as an application of, do we always apply authentic ahadith, right? Or do we always apply them literally? Because they're saying different things. So the first hadith is عن شداد بن أوس رضي الله عنه أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أتى على رجل بالبقيع وهو يحتجم في رمضان فقال أفطر الحاجم والمحجوم. So Shaddad ibn Aus, the companion, reports that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ came upon a man in Baqiyah receiving cupping in the month of Ramadan. He said, the one cupping, the hajim, and the one receiving the cupping, the mahjum, both of them break their fast. Okay? Now this hadith, from a hadith specialist perspective, from the perspective of the muhaddithin, okay, it's narrated in, Ibn Majah, Nasa'i, Abu Dawood, and Ahmad, okay? It's also narrated by Tirmidhi. Tirmidhi also says about the hadith that Bukhari considered it sahih. So Bukhari doesn't include it in his collection, okay? However, in his collection of Ilal al-Hadith, Imam Tirmidhi, who is a student of Bukhari, importantly, a direct student, he says that Imam Bukhari considered it sahih, okay? So we have all of that evidence, and as well as I mentioned some others who considered sahih as well, and some even consider it to be mutawatir. Okay, remember mutawatir, massively transmitted, because it's narrated by at least 16 of the companions. Okay, so it might even be mutawatir. So it's a very strong hadith, and it says, Shaddad's hadith says that both the person cupping and the one who is cupped, both of them break their fast. A second hadith by Ibn Abbas, عن ابن عباس رضي الله عنهما أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم احتجم وهو محرم واحتجم وهو صائم. that the Prophet Muhammad, Ibn Abbas reports that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam did cupping, that he received cupping while he was in ihram and while he was fasting. Okay? And this hadith is in both Bukhari and Muslim. So in the first hadith, the Prophet says, the one who receives cupping and does cupping, they break their fast. And the second hadith says the Prophet ﷺ received cupping while he was fasting. Right? So it seems to be a contradiction, right? What is going on here? A third hadith by Anas, okay, عن أنس بن مالك رضي الله عنه قال: أول ما كرهت الحجامة للصائم أن جعفر بن أبي طالب رضي الله عنه احتجم وهو صائم فمر به النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فقال: أفطر هذان. ثم رخص النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم بعد في الحجامة للصائم وكان أنس يحتجم وهو صائم. So narrated from Anas ibn Malik that the first time that cupping was disliked, literally it says disliked, but it also means prohibited here. The first time that cupping was prohibited for the fasting person was when Ja'far ibn Abi Talib received cupping while he was fasting. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed by and said, these two have broken their fast, meaning the cupper and the cuppi, if that's a word, the person receiving cupping. Later on, the Prophet allowed cupping for the fasting person. And Anas used to receive cupping while he was fasting. So this hadith is considered by Daraqutni in this narration to be sahih. And there's some debate about other narrations that have other parts in the hadith, but I'm going to skip that for the time being. But the hadith is, at least by some, considered sahih. And then finally, we have the companions' practice. Okay, as we mentioned, this was something that was obviously debated. 16 of them narrated the first hadith that it breaks the fast. And so we're also interested in their practice. So we know that many of the companions, including Anas, as mentioned in the previous hadith, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas and Abdullah ibn Umar, that they received cupping while fasting. And then there's other reports that indicate that some companions would wait until after iftar to receive cupping. Okay, so some of them had it done while fasting, others had it done after they broke their fast. So what is the ruling then? The question is, does cupping break the fast of the fasting person? So we have at least four data points here. The first is Shaddad saying that the two break, the fast of both the cupper and the cuppi are broken. Okay. Ibn Abbas says the Prophet received cupping while he was fasting. And then Anas said at first it wasn't allowed, right? And then later the Prophet allowed it, rakhasa, right? That he later allowed it. And then we have companion practice that indicates some of them received it during the fast, some of them waited, okay? So we have these three different possibilities. We can either say there's an abrogation, there's a change in the ruling, we can harmonize the evidence, or we can establish which evidence is stronger. So looking now at how the different schools of thought resolved this seeming contradiction or this conflict. So the Hanbalis, they went with establishing preponderance. So they basically argued that cupping breaks the fast because of the hadith of Shaddad, the first hadith. So as I mentioned, this first hadith is very strong. There's multiple transmissions. It's mutawatir for some, etc., etc. They said that this hadith is the soundest of the hadith, and it establishes the cupping, that cupping breaks the fast. This is their primary textual evidence, and they have other additional evidence and rationalizations and ways of reasoning. So they say, for example, that the statements of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ take precedence over his action. This is a general principle in usul al-fiqh, that when the Prophet says something, that takes precedence over what he himself does. So the fact that he received the second hadith that says it's allowed is on the basis of what the Prophet himself ﷺ did, not what he said, right? So the implication there is there could be a distinction between what he does for himself, that's only unique to him, and what he tells people to do. And what he tells us to do is more important and more given priority over what he himself does. And they also say that it's the removal of the blood from the body, right, is similar to other things that also break the fast, right? Like menstruation for women, right? Or like ejaculation, that when these impurities come out of the person's body, right, it breaks the fast. And so therefore, that when impurity comes out of the cupper's cup, right, this blood that's coming out, that is akin to, analogous to these other forms of impurities coming out of the body, right? So they have different ways of rationalizing, in addition to the primary focus. Again, the Hanbalis primarily textualist arguments oftentimes, and this is an example of that. So they are weighing the evidence. That's how they're resolving this conflict. They're weighing the evidence. Now, the other three schools, the Shafi'is, the Hanafis, and the Malikis, they said it does not break the fast. Hijama, cupping while fasting, does not break the fast. And they reasoned this on the basis of either abrogation or harmonization. Okay, so the argument for abrogation is that the hadith of Shaddad, okay, that the Prophet ﷺ walks by two people doing cupping and he says their fast is broken, they date that hadith to the 8th year of Hijrah, okay, because in other narrations of that hadith, and because of the third hadith in which Ja'far is mentioned, they say that it's Am al-Fath, the 8th year of the Hijrah, when Mecca was opened, and that's when that incident happened. And then they say the hadith of Ibn Abbas that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ received cupping while he was in ihram and while he was fasting. They date that hadith to the 10th year of the Hijrah, okay, during the Hajj. And they say, therefore, in addition, so they also use the hadith of Anas, who says there was a change in ruling, right? They use that hadith to then argue that there was initially a ruling up until sometime around the 8th year when it wasn't allowed. And then, as Anas said, the Prophet permitted it, rakhasahu. And the very word rakhasa means it wasn't allowed and then it became allowed, right? And also the practice of the companions, right? That Anas himself narrates the hadith, he applied it, and other companions also received cupping while fasting. And then they also argue that you can harmonize all of the hadith, you can keep them all by interpreting the hadith that says that the two, the cupper and the person receiving the cupping, that they break their fast, that you understand that to mean that they are liable to break the fast, right? It's not that they literally break the fast immediately as soon as the blood emerges from the body, but that cupping itself creates weakness in the person. It's like, when you go for blood donation, then you have to sit and you have to, have a popsicle and stuff because it creates weakness through that removal of the blood. And so it's breaking the fast in the sense of the person might then have to break the fast because of the weakness in the body, the person who's receiving the cupping. And as for the person who's giving the cupping, the way in which cupping used to take place, now they just put these suction cups and then they remove them. But it used to be that they created the suction by actually sucking, right? So you would have the cup and the person who's performing the cupping would actually be creating the suction themselves by sucking the cup, right? And usually they're experts, so they don't actually swallow it, but it's possible that they could swallow it. So they say the person who's doing the cupping could accidentally swallow the blood. The person receiving the cupping is going to be weak and they might not be able to finish their fast. And that's what he means by they break their fast, is that they're opening themselves up to having to break the fast. And there's also this kind of the linguistic interpretation in that is attested to in other ahadith where the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ says, he'll say that a person will, steal an egg for which his hand is cut off, right? And we know that we can't interpret that literally because an egg doesn't have the value for which a person's hand is amputated, right? But the actual Arabic says فَتُقْطَعْ يَدَهُ, right? That his hand is cut off, not because of the egg, but it's like a slippery slope where they begin with stealing the egg. And the hadith also says they steal a piece of rope, they steal an egg, and then their hand is cut off for both of them. Not for the actual stealing of the egg and the rope, but because it leads them then, from a rope, an egg, and then, a whole grocery store, right? That it's because they started with the egg that their hand later on is cut off, right? So it's this idea that it's not literally their hand is cut off because of the egg or the rope. It's not literally that the person, their fast is broken, but it's diminished because either the value of the fast is diminished for some spiritual reason, or because it's liable that they're going to then have to break their fast, right? So I think that should be understood. And then they'll say about the companions that, they also practice this. The Hanbalis will respond to these arguments and they'll say, no, many of the companions didn't. They did the hijama, they did the cupping after after iftar. And then the other side will say, well, they chose to do that, but that's not actually the only allowable thing, right? That it's allowable to also do the cupping while you're fasting. So that brings an end then to the lesson for today. And let me just give a quick summary, and then we'll get into some questions, inshallah. So we talked about weak ahadith and when and how they're applied, if they're corroborated, attested to, or encouraged, or they encourage good deeds and they meet the conditions that we discussed. And then we started talking about the work of the jurist in determining the sunnah, and the fact that if there's disagreement, they're going to have a slight, nuance or distinction about where they draw that circle and what data points they're going to include in that determination. We talked about some of the reasons why the schools differ, and we saw how that's applied in this hadith of cupping, the relative emphasis in legal reasoning, and then 3 ways in which they will harmonize contradictory evidence. And it's not that they'll pick one of these 3 ways, but that each of these 3 means of harmonizing evidence will figure in the discussion in some way. So we saw with the Shafi'is, Malikis, and Hanafis, they both argued from the perspective of abrogation, and they also argued from the perspective of interpreting the hadith in light of each other, right? Whereas the Hanbalis said, no, the hadith of Shaddad is the strongest. They did tawjih. They established the strongest evidence, and they based their opinion primarily on that. Okay, so what we'll do next week, inshallah, is we'll do a few more case studies like this, just to see how all of this works together and how the jurists reason and how they apply a hadith that have legal application. And we'll see again some of these methods of abrogation, harmonization, prioritizing stronger evidence, and we'll see how hadith primarily, that's the focus here, of how hadith figures in these analyses and in these legal conclusions and in these processes of legal reasoning, inshallah. So now let's turn to some of your questions, inshallah. Okay, so is the trustworthiness of a narrator affected if he transmits both sahih hadith and also weak hadith? Okay, so that question is actually, let me just come out of this share screen. Okay, so that question is actually the reverse of the way we should be thinking about it. Okay, so the narrator, okay, he's not transmitting sahih hadith or da'if hadith. Okay, he's just transmitting a hadith. Okay, all of them. Okay, he's just transmitting 10 hadith, for example. Okay, then some of his hadith might be considered sahih, and some of them might be considered da'if, if he himself is a reliable transmitter. Okay, so if he's a reliable transmitter and a trustworthy transmitter, so he himself is upright and he himself is accurate, then all of his hadith could be sahih, or they could be da'if for other reasons. Okay, such as, for example, someone else in the chain is weak, or his hadith is anomalous, that although it itself is sahih and it meets all the requirements, his narration is outweighed by a greater narration of more reliable people, or a greater number who narrate it differently. So that hadith by itself would be da'if, but he himself is not a da'if transmitter. Okay, so the way it works is basically each transmitter is going to be assigned a value of their trustworthiness and their accuracy. Okay, if they are inaccurate and untrustworthy, then all of their hadiths will be da'if. Any chain that they appear in will be da'if. Okay, but if they're a trustworthy, reliable transmitter, their hadith could then be sahih or da'if depending on other considerations. Okay. Okay, this was asked last week as well, I think. Was Imam Bukhari a mujtahid also? And if not, why? And if not, why did he bring a single hadith multiple times in his compilation? So Imam Bukhari is considered to have been himself a mujtahid of sorts. Okay. However, and they'll say that his fiqh, right, like his understanding of the law, is evident from the way in which he himself composed the book, right? Both where he mentions a hadith how he did the tabweeb, the chapter divisions, the chapter titles of the book itself is kind of an artful way of presenting his fiqh, right? So the title of many of the books themselves in the sections on law themselves tell you what you apply of that hadith, okay? However, because he didn't himself found a legal school, there isn't, you know, there isn't a clear like legal methodology. There isn't, you know, students who then carry on that school and so on. His school, his fiqh didn't actually continue, right? So for subsequent scholars to Bukhari, right, they'll take an interest in how he organized the book, where he mentioned a hadith, to understand, you know, what he understood from the hadith and how he himself would perhaps apply or understand them to be applicable. But that we don't actually base our practice. Nobody really bases their practice on the way in which he organizes the book. But it certainly is interesting from a historical perspective, and for jurists as well to consider what Bukhari was understanding from the hadith that he narrates. How do we report weak hadith then if we can't attribute them to the Prophet? Why do we attribute it to? Who do we attribute it to? That's a great question. So, and the last questions were also really good. All of the questions are very good. I'm very happy with the questions. Thank you. So how do we report weak hadith then if we can't attribute them to the Prophet, and who do we attribute it to? So sometimes, in fact, the hadith would be attributed to a companion. So instead of being muttasil to the Prophet, instead of the chain continuing to the Prophet, it's actually mawquf, which means that it's properly narrated and ascribed to Ibn Umar, for example. But Ibn Umar is not saying the Prophet said something. Ibn Umar himself is saying something, right? So that hadith as a transmission to the Prophet, right, as being muttasil to the Prophet, it's weak, but as attributed to Ibn Umar or to any other companion, it's sahih in a companion analysis, right, of that hadith, right? So then it becomes useful because we know, okay, Ibn Umar did this, he applied this, right? Or he understood this, right? But then he's one companion among others. And so the fact that he's not narrating it from the Prophet is really significant, because he's not saying the Prophet told me something. He's saying, this is what I understand, this is what I believe, this is what I practice, and therefore it can be compared to what the other companions practiced and believed. But if we say it's from the Prophet, then it trumps anything the other companions thought or believed or understood, right? So it could be that we can attribute it to someone else, maybe a companion, maybe one of the tabi'een. Sometimes that's the problem with the chain. The weakness is due to a disconnect in the chain in relation to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. That's a possibility. But if it's weak because there's a weak transmitter, or because there's some other, you know, anomaly or defect in the chain, in the hadith or in the chain, then we would just say it's a weak. We just say it's a weak hadith. That's all. We don't have to. We say its attribution to the Prophet is weak. Sihatuhu, its attribution is weak, but you know, we're assuming that our audience then knows it doesn't mean that it's thrown out, right? So we would distinguish between da'if jiddan, right? It's a very weak hadith, right? Or, you know, da'if yasir, it's a, you know, light weakness, or da'if, but, you know, its meaning is correct. This is often what you'll hear, the hadith I mentioned that you can use in exhorting or encouraging good acts, right? Often what you'll hear a good teacher say is that the hadith is weak, but it's attested to. It's weak, but its meaning is correct, right? So that tells you that although formally it's a weak hadith, right? The hadith itself, its meaning is correct. It's something that we can apply. It's attested to by either a hadith, or, you know, it falls under this rubric that I mentioned, that it's not very weak. It falls under a general principle and so on. So the only thing we would do basically is to just say that the hadith is weak, but you know, explain why you're quoting it, its meaning is correct, or, you know, it's not very weak, or some people consider it weak, or it's attested to by other ahadith, something like that, right? Is human testimony not reliable based on many studies? How can we know that the narrators didn't forget stuff? That's also a good question. So we rely on those who've done that, you know, really close study that I described last week, right? That look at each of the narrators, they figure out, you know, from the testimony and the criticisms of their contemporaries what the quality of their narrations were, right? So they'll say that, so-and-so is reliable, or he's only reliable when he narrates from, these teachers, or he's only reliable in his narrations until he became senile. So they're very exacting in their criticism of these people. And there's also difference of opinion among the critics, right? So the critics that will evaluate the transmitters, they're contemporaneous to them. They live at the same time. It's a peer review process, right? So certain expert muhaddithin are not just transmitting, but they're actually, they go and look at each of the transmitters. They interview them directly. They ask about them from different people. They figure out the timeline of their travels, who they met, when they changed, all of that stuff I mentioned last week. So they're then going to come up with a conclusion, a criticism, an evaluation of that transmitter. Okay, so that's one thing. Okay, figuring out, each transmitter, how reliable they are. That's one thing. The second thing is that we'll notice these slight nuances in how hadith are transmitted, because sometimes the companions or the people after them, the transmitters after them, would transmit things by meaning, right? So it's not always that they transmitted, literally the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, Qala Rasulullah X, but sometimes even in the hadith we saw, it says, Ibn Abbas, Qala Ibn Abbas, Anna Nabi ﷺ fa'ala kada aw qala kada, right? Not that he's not quoting the Prophet said something. He said the Prophet used to do this, or the Prophet would say this, right? So there's something called riwaya bil ma'na, that they're transmitting on the basis of meaning, and that is part of the reason why sometimes there's these slight nuances between two companions or two chains of narration that are narrating things with a slight nuance, right? So that answers that question in part, but to be honest with you, until you actually go and look at this whole science of criticism of the transmitters, it's hard to actually imagine, how exacting and how sophisticated this process was, right? But it really, like, for each transmitter, there's like multiple points of view and multiple testimonies about his reliability and the details of his reliability, if it changed and when it changed and so on, right? And then again, on top of that, there's also, most of the time, there's multiple transmissions. So you're checking, transmitters against other transmitters and transmissions against other transmissions, right? And that's also really important because it gives you this aggregated picture. Okay, could you also highlight the importance of embracing the differences between scholars or schools? So when a hadith is weak, we should wait and embrace that it may be correct in other schools. I'm not sure I actually understand this question. So I think I need an example, perhaps, of what you mean. I'm not really understanding waiting. So when a hadith is weak, if there's other authentications of that hadith, if there's other evaluations of the hadith that other people don't consider it weak, for example, right? Then we would know that at the same time. So if a hadith, like I've mentioned, sometimes it's weak according to some people, it's sound, hasan according to others, right? Then we would know the range of possibilities concerning that one hadith as soon as we transmit that hadith, right? And then as for application, they're not applying it in a particular way. The jurists are not applying it in a particular way on the basis only of its authenticity, but on the basis of how it fits within this larger aggregated picture of all of the relevant proof, right? So it might itself be sahih, but it's, the ruling changed, or it's outweighed, or it's understood in light of something else. So I'm not exactly sure if that answers your question. Okay, let's see what else we have here. What happens when a prophetic prophecy turns out to be true, but it's from a weak hadith? So nothing in particular happens, but it just means that, we cannot formally ascribe that hadith at a higher level than it being weak, because somebody in the chain is weak, or there's some disconnect in the chain or something like that. So formally, we would still say the hadith its ascription is weak, right? But we would say its meaning is correct because it's been shown to be correct because it's actually occurred, for example, right? Or it's corroborated by other hadiths about the end of time, for instance. So the fact that it's da'if doesn't mean, again, that it's not properly ascribed. There's likely more than 50% chance for many of them that they are indeed ascribed to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, so I think we'll stop here. We're at an hour and 20 minutes. Thank you for your patience and your attention. Inshallah, next time, if there's more questions I haven't gotten to, we'll try to look at those, and we'll come back to look at more case studies, inshallah, which will give you hopefully more clarity and depth of understanding for the principles that we studied. Jazakumullahu khaira. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Nastaghfiruka Allahumma wa natubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.